Chapter 1. 10 Halfpennies. When Baldemar turned 10, his mother said to him, "I've taught you everything I know. Now you must go to school." Baldemar said he preferred to stay at home, helping to grow and sell the cabbages and pumpkins that provided a portion of their income. His mother looked up from the great tub in which she was doing someone's washing and said, "Cabbages and pumpkins will not feed us when I'm too old to work. By then you must be able to earn a good income. For that, you must go to school." The boy conceived a stroke of genius. "But Master Thwack will want money." But his mother had foreseen his strategy before she broached the subject. "I've made an arrangement with Mr. Thwack. I will do his laundry in recompense." At that young age, Baldemar had not learned how to keep emotions like surprise and skepticism from leaping onto the stage that was his face. But the impending thunder that clouded his mother's brow told him that he should keep his doubts to himself. Later, when he considered the matter from the vantage of the age of 12, he came to the conclusion that clean clothes were not the only service his mother was providing to the unspoused schoolmaster, and that to raise the issue, especially at that late date, would help no one. And so, when the new term began, soon after the 10th anniversary of his naming day, Baldemar took up his copybook and 2 pencils and set off to walk across the city of Vanderoy to Penandink Close, where Master Thwack maintained his grammar school. But his education began before he arrived. Penandink Close, as its name indicated, was a short street that dead-ended at the back wall of the incarcery. There was thus only one way in, and that was also the only way out. Baldemar reached this sole entry by crossing the plaza of the moneyers, where money changers and dealers in varying weights of gold and silver plied their trade. Foreigners recently arrived at Vanderoy came here to find coins they could trust, and Vanderovians planning to leave the county bought ingots whose purity was guaranteed by the stamp of the Moneyers' Guild. Baldemar paid the booths no heed. Silver and gold were well beyond his young life's scope. He did, however, have a bronze halfpenny in his shoe, given him by his mother to buy bread and cheese for his lunch. But when he reached the entrance to Penandink Close, his way was suddenly blocked by a tall and husky boy some years older than he, who was accompanied by 2 similar specimens, only slightly smaller.
"Starting school?"
said the big one, with an expression of overt curiosity. "Yes," said Baldemar. He sought to pass around the questioner, but somehow positions shifted and he found himself surrounded.
"Got to pay school tax,"
said the boy in front of him.
"No, I don't,"
said the new scholar. The sequence of events that followed was brief and inevitable. Baldemar could have handled himself well enough had there been just one of them. He probably would not have won, but he had often convinced opponents that the pain of the struggle was not worth the victory. But there were 3 of them. 2 to hold him, and 1, the biggest one, to punch him in the belly until he could not breathe and thought he might throw up his breakfast. They released him, and while he lay curled and winded on the cobblestones, they efficiently frisked him and found the halfpenny. They left him his book, but broke both pencils, saying,
"Let that be a lesson to you."
Then they dismissed him from their thoughts and turned toward the next arriving schoolboy, who, experienced in their ways, already had his tax out ready to pay. Baldemar went to school. His stomach stopped hurting after a while, but by the time he was going home, it had started paining him again from emptiness. The same thing happened the next day, and the day after, and continued without cease. Baldemar took to putting a cob of bread in his pocket before leaving the house, but sometimes the tax collectors, their names he discovered were Bedloe, Wes, and Shano, took that as well, and tore it into pieces that they ate, smiling, in front of him. He discussed the depredations with his fellow students, and discovered that various attempts to end them had been tried. 2 years previously, a bold young lad had organized the braver boys of the school into a desperate squad. They had armed themselves with sticks and rocks, confronted the bullies, and chased them off. But that afternoon, Bedloe had stealthily tracked the leader of the revolt as he went home. When he came out the next morning, he was set upon so thoroughly he was left with a broken leg. His parents withdrew him from Thwack's academy, and the revolt lost its spirit. Baldemar considered other possibilities. Telling his mother could do no good and would only distress her. Going to the city watch would be equally inefficacious. They confined their interest to the protection of merchants and persons of stature. Street boys' affairs were beneath their notice. He thought about getting a knife and stabbing Bedloe, but spilled blood would upset the money changers and bullioneers. Ironically, their discontent would bring the watch into the situation, and not to Baldemar's benefit. One morning, as he approached Pennendink Close through the plaza, hearing the clink of coins being counted and dropped into purses, a new thought occurred. Geberon, the money changer, who had his booth on the side of the plaza nearest to the tax collection zone, was also known as Geberon, the money lender. And to ensure that his loans were repaid on time and with full interest, Geberon employed Wundt. Wundt was not the largest man in Vanderoy, nor was he most able with fists and feet, but he was more able than the largest fellow and larger than the most able. This combination, along with a reputation for his capacity to take a punch that would kill a lesser man, meant that he rarely had to use his abilities. The mere sight of Wundt hoving into view was almost always completely convincing. Geberon's balance sheet showed very few unrecoverable loans. Baldemar stopped before Geberon's booth. The moneyer was counting stacks of oryx minted in the county of Chancery and making entries in his ledger. Wundt was sitting in his usual place, on a stool next to the booth, using a small knife to peel an apple. He took note of the boy and regarded him at first with a neutral gaze that became an unvoiced question. Baldemar made up his mind and approached the man.
Do you hire out?
He said. Geberon glanced over at this distraction, frowned, tusked, and returned to his calculations. Wundt cut himself a slice of apple, put it in his mouth, chewed, swallowed, and said, "Sometimes."
I have a problem,
Baldemar said. "So I've seen," the man said. When he saw the surprise in the boy's face, he added, "Anything that happens near my employer's booth, I'll make a note of it."
I was wondering,
Baldemar began. "How much do they take from you?" Wundt said.
a halfpenny a day.
"That's below my usual rate. Well below." Baldemar thought and said,
If I paid you 5 pennies, would that be enough?
"Have you got 5 pennies?"
No.
"Well then." Wundt cut and ate another piece of apple.
If I paid you half a penny a day for 10 days?
The man studied him for a while, chewing. Then he said, "How old are you?"
10?
"You're small for your age." Baldemar shrugged. Wundt stood up and held out one arm, straight from the shoulder. "Grab hold of that," he said. "Both hands, and show me how long you can hang without letting go." Baldemar had to stand on the stool to reach. He got a two-handed grip on the man's wrist, kicked away from the stool, and hung there, feet inches from the ground. If Wundt noticed his weight, he made no show of it. The boy heard soft sounds and realized that Wundt was counting slowly. When he reached 60, Wundt gave the arm a small shake. Baldemar clung more tightly. He did not know what this was in aid of, but working in his mother's garden had put some strength in his arms, and he was proud of that. Wundt continued to count. Baldemar continued to hang, until finally the man said, "Fair enough. You can let go." The boy dropped and clasped his hands behind him so the man would not see how his arms shook from strain.
Well,
he said. Wundt sat again. He studied Baldemar, and some thought went on behind his pale eyes. After a while, he said, "Halfpenny a day for 10 days.
Done.
Wundt looked at him sidelong and said, "Suppose I just take the money and do nothing." He poked around his gums with his tongue, dislodging bits of apple. Suppose I take over the whole racket.
You won't?
Why not?
Reputation? Said the boy. Maybe you did that kind of thing when you were a boy like Bedloe, but not now.
He looked Vunt straight in the eye.
That would be cheesy.
The man put another piece of apple into his mouth and made a sound somewhere down in his throat. Half the fruit was now left, and he cut that in two and handed a piece to Baldemar. First payment today, he said. Baldemar gave him the day's halfpenny while he chewed and swallowed the wedge of apple.
Can you do it now? Said Baldemar. You can trust me to pay.
You can trust me to collect, said Vunt, pocketing the bronze coin. He gave the boy a look that might have implied amusement, then said, All right, but you don't tell anyone about the delayed payment. Baldemar understood.
Reputation, he said.
Vunt nodded, eased off the stool. For a big man, he moved with smooth and sinuous motions. He cocked his head to indicate that Baldemar should go toward pen and ink close, then followed along a few paces behind. Bedloe, Wes, and Shano saw him coming and deployed themselves as usual. Baldemar stopped in front of them, and Bedloe held out a palm. Their taxpayer made no move to hand over the tariff, and Bedloe's face was in the process of marshalling his outrage when a shadow fell over them. The big boy looked up at a much bigger man, and his expression changed. Wes and Shano each took a step backwards. Vunt said, He's with me. Baldemar watched the trio depart. He said to Vunt,
I'm in your debt.
Yes, you are, said the collector, to the amount of 4.5 pennies payable at a halfpenny per day with 9 days to fulfill the obligation.
I will fulfill it.
You will. All debts must be discharged. It is a simple philosophy and occasionally a cruel one, but it provides an adequate basis for an orderly life. Baldemar duly discharged his debt to Vunt. Time passed, and Baldemar proved an adequate student at Thwack's Academy. He could read and write a passable hand, do sums in his head or on the chalk-grade slate, and name the principal cities of the land and their rulers. But he did not grow much larger, even though he was getting all his daily meals. Each day, as he crossed the Plaza of Moneyers, he would nod respectfully to Geberon's collection agent, and Vunt would acknowledge the greeting with a grunt or the tiniest dip of his head. One afternoon, as the boy was making his way home, Vunt stopped him with a raised finger. Take these, the man said, holding out 2 pieces of rolled iron. They were inconsequential in Vunt's hand, but Baldemar felt their weight when he took them. Here's what you do, said the man, and he showed Baldemar how to hold his arms still and bend the elbows, a piece of iron in each hand, breathing out as he lifted the weights, breathing in as he lowered them. Do it 10 times, rest while you count to 60, then do it 10 times again. Another rest, then 10 times more. Baldemar did not ask why. He simply said,
Does this place me in your debt again?
If you benefit from it, it does. The boy nodded and went off with the iron in his book bag. At home, he did the exercises faithfully as he had been shown. At first, he felt some strain in his biceps before he completed the 3rd set of 10, but by the end of 2 weeks, he was doing 4 sets without difficulty. Vunt stopped him as he passed the next morning. He bade Baldemar to flex his arms and felt the hardened muscle. Good, he said, and showed the boy another exercise that developed the back of the upper arm. Alternate 1 set of that with 1 of the first I showed you.
My debt increases, said Baldemar.
You could look at it that way, said Vunt. As the weeks wore on, Vunt showed him more and different exercises designed to strengthen the chest, the back, the legs, and the belly. But he never gave him heavier weights to work with, just more repetitions. The boy lost some of the roundedness of childhood and began to assume the form of the man he would become. "I've grown harder," he told Vunt after several months, "but no bigger." "Size can be a disadvantage," the collector replied. "The thing is to make the most of what you have." He looked his pupil over and said, "And you're doing that?" By the time Baldemar was 14, he was running errands for Vunt and being paid in bronze pennies and sometimes even a silver half-ducat. He gave the pennies to his mother to help with the housekeeping, but the silver coin he hid in the little closet-sized room that was his sleeping place. From his toing and froing for Vunt, he gained useful knowledge. Usually, he was sent only to remind someone that a payment was coming due on a debt to Geberon and that the remittance must be delivered on time. But sometimes he was sent to discover the whereabouts of a delinquent borrower, and from those assignments Baldemar learned how to acquire information without disclosing his interest and how to follow someone who did not wish to be followed. He also gained valuable insights into human nature that aged him beyond his years. It was after using his developed abilities to locate a defaulting debtor who had gone to ground that he earned his second half-ducat. When he came to report, Vunt slid off his stool and said, "Take me there." They went through the winding streets, and the boy was interested to see that he had an easier progress than usual. Other pedestrians melted aside as Vunt approached. Even carters urged their beasts into gutters to make room for the collector. They came to the house where the defaulter was hiding, a multi-storied but rickety tenement. Vunt said, "You go and wait beside the back door," then began to climb the urine-stained steps with a surprisingly quiet tread. Baldemar did as he was told and positioned himself in the back alley, which reeked of refuse and even less savory leavings. He stood beside a narrow door whose lock was hanging loose. A little time passed, then the boy heard a thumping of descending footsteps, 2 sets, and growing louder. Vunt had not told him what to expect, but he put the situation together in his mind, and at the precise moment, he stuck his foot out across the doorstep. A man, hurtling toward the exit, encountered the barrier and went sprawling into the alley. He got to his hands and knees with admirable speed, but Baldemar kicked one wrist out from under him so that he fell flat again. By now, Vunt had squeezed through the narrow doorway and joined the scene. He picked up the man by the back of his jerkin and shook him like a dusty rag. Then he let him fall to the filthy pavement, put a foot on his lower back to hold him still, and said, "This is what you get for making me chase you." Still with his foot on the squirming debtor, he stooped and took hold of the man's left hand, pulled it toward him. Baldemar heard a crack and the man scream. Vunt said, "Tomorrow, you come and pay the installment. If not, I'll find you and break the other thumb. I'll think about the elbows overnight. You should think about them too." At 15, Baldemar left school and went to work full-time for Geberon the Moneyer, whose affairs were thriving. Vunt vouched for him, and he was put on a salary, with a commission for the routine collections he began making on his own. Occasionally, an assignment was not quite as routine as it ought to have been, and he would resort to some of the methods Vunt had trained him in. He kept up his daily exercises, but had long since increased the weights he used. Still, he did not make the error of constantly raising the poundage. Vunt had taught him that the biggest muscles were not necessarily the strongest. You get into a dually with some big slab of beef, all you got to do is keep away, let him tire himself out punching and rushing, then you clip him here, or maybe here, and down he goes. Baldemar's mother no longer took in laundry, and Master Thwack's attentions had ceased when Baldemar began to bring home a steady stream of pennies. When he went on salary and commission, he revealed to her his cache of silver half-ducats and ducats, which was enough to move them to a house in a better quarter of Vanderoy, though she still planted cabbages and pumpkins on the roof. "They're not much work," she told him, "and they always sell." He did not argue with her work ethic, and she did not question too closely what he did for the money changer and his brute. The neighbours treated her with respect, and she even made some friends with whom she could gossip in the afternoons after her garden was properly tended. "You're a good boy," she told her son. "It was worth it to send you to school." Baldemar could see no connection between his time in Pennendink Close and his burgeoning career, except that if he hadn't had to cross the square leading to it, he would not have encountered Vunt. But he said nothing, just nodded and said, "Yes, mother," because he owed her peace of mind. "You see that rope?" Vunt said. They were passing along an alley behind a row of tenements. Baldemar looked and saw that the tiers of wooden steps intended to be an escape route in the event of a fire had rotted and collapsed. In their place, someone had hung a thick rope, probably a scrap of ship's rigging, from the cornice that overhung the roof. "Yes?" he said. Vunt was already turning into the little yard behind the building, kicking his way through the mounds of debris, including the parts of the steps that had been too rotted to burn as firewood, which had accumulated over the years. When they reached the wall, he said, "Get hold of that, pull yourself up, then stick your legs straight out in front of you." Baldemar, as always, did as his mentor required. "Now," said the man, "hand over hand to the top. Pause there, then down again. For hands only. Keep your legs stuck straight out." It was like pulling on a rope to lift something on a pulley, except it was Baldemar who was lifted until his head almost touched the cornice. He paused there, looking out over the rooftops, and could see all the way to the Duke's palace. Then he effortlessly descended. Vunt studied him as he hung from the rope, then said, "Put your feet down now. Let's go." They went on with their day. The collector never mentioned the point of the exercise. A month after Baldemar turned 16, on a morning like any other, as they were setting out from the booth to perform their routine duties for Geberon, Vunt said, "I have a job for you." "All right," said Baldemar, expecting to be given a collection to make. But Vunt said, "Meet me in the alley down the street from the Weeping Mermaid, after dark, and wear your darkest clothing." A shiver of anticipation went through the young man. He did his jobs for the day, wondering what adventure his mentor had in mind for him. When night fell, he dressed in black, kissed his mother's cheek, and set off for the fountain with its lachrymose fish maiden. Down the hill a few paces, he found Vunt waiting for him. "Come on," the man said, and led him into the deeper dark of the narrow thoroughfare. Not far along, they came to a tall building whose backyard was enclosed by a stone wall topped with iron spikes. A strong gate of the same metal was locked against them, but Vunt produced a key and let them in. He had a key to the back door as well, and they entered and climbed worn marble steps to the top floor, where another key admitted them to a sparsely furnished apartment. "Is this yours?" Baldemar said. He had never been invited to Vunt's home. "In a manner of speaking," was the answer, "though my name appears on no relevant documents." "I see," the boy said, though he didn't really. On the floor in one of the rooms was a long coil of stout rope with a grapnel affixed to one end. Vunt picked it up and said, "Come." In a corner stood a ladder, and above it, in the ceiling, was a trapdoor. Vunt climbed the ladder, undid a heavy bolt, and pushed the trap up, laying it silently on the roof outside. He pulled himself through the opening, and Baldemar, following, was led to a corner of the building that faced the alley they had just walked along. "What are we doing?" he said. "Discharging your debt," Vunt said. It was dark on the roof, but enough light came down from the stars and leaked up from the trapdoor for the boy to see where the collector pointed, a building of equal height across the alley that was protected by a high stone wall atop which shards of glass glinted faintly in the starlight. As Baldemar peered to make out detail, The building was unlit from within and without. The big man shook out the rope coil, spun it around his head, then flung the grapnelled end across the intervening distance. The metal hooks caught on something on the opposite roof, and Vunt pulled the rope taut and snugged it around a heavy spike driven into the lip of the roof they were standing on. "Now," said the man, "you will pass along the rope to the window just below it, go into the room, find an item, and bring it back to me." "The window is barred," Baldemar said. He could just make out the lengths of iron. Vunt hung something around his neck, a cord with a weight attached. The boy touched it, a disc of metal, and the thing tingled his fingertips. "It is a charm," Vunt said. "Touch it against the bars, to the window sash, to the strong box you will find bolted to the floor. Do not touch your fingertips to any of them. Use the joints of your fingers. All that the charm touches will open. Leave everything open and bring me what is in the strong box." "What will that be?" "Only a key." "Whose key?" The big man hesitated, then said, "Geberon's." "We are stealing from our employer." For all his experiences among the kind of people who borrowed from the money changer, some of whom he would never have introduced to his mother, Baldemar was shocked. And, now that he thought about it, a little afraid. "I don't know if I can do it," he said. Vunt strummed the taut rope with a finger. "You've been training to do it since the age of 10. "I mean—" "I know what you mean. But know this. Geberon means to up stakes and move to Nendigo. He's saved enough to buy himself a seat on the fiduciary pool when one comes open next year. You and I will not be going with him. Indeed, in the unlikely event we were to meet him on the steps of the Nendigo Exchange, he would not deign to recognize us." "That seems harsh," the boy said. "Geberon did not become Geberon by nursing sick kittens," Vunt said. "You know this for sure and certain?" "It has always been his dream. He used to speak of it often. Lately, he does not." Baldemar weighed his concerns only briefly. He owed a great deal to Vunt, not so much to their master. "Will he suspect me?" "No," said Vunt. "I've thought this through over a long time. Now, please, go." The "please" somehow made the final difference. Baldemar eased over the lip of the roof, seized the rope, and went hand over hand across the gap. It was no more difficult for him than walking the same distance. He reached the window, hung by one hand while he touched the charm to the bars and the sash. One swung open, and the other flew up. The room was dark, but the charm glowed with enough light for him to see the strong box in the middle of the bare floorboards. Baldemar pressed the charm to its lock, and it sprang open. Careful not to let his fingers touch anything but the key that was the container's sole contents, he picked it up and tucked it into his shirt. Only seconds later, he was back on the other side of the alley, handing the key to Vunt. The man accepted it and pressed it into a small box, took it out again, wiped it clean on his shirt, and said, "Now go and put it back where you found it. Touch the charm to box, window, and bars as you return. They will close themselves." Baldemar did as he was asked. The whole process took less than a minute. Then Vunt shook the grapnel clear of its grip and recoiled the rope. "Good work," he said. "Now I will buy you supper." Over a meal in a tavern, the man leaned across the table and said, "In a couple of days I will find fault with your attitude and dismiss you from Geberon's service." Baldemar's first instinct was to protest, but he swallowed his objection half-formed. "All right," he said. "I have found you a new position, if you want it, with an old associate of mine. Easier work, and the pay will be better." Vunt fixed him with the stare that so many had found daunting. "And you may consider any debt to me to be discharged in full." And thus, at 16, Baldemar became a wizard's henchman, junior grade. The wizard's name was Thelarion, and after his name he added the sobriquet, the Exemplary, though Baldemar never heard anyone else do so. The youth had little to do with his employer, however. Thelarion stood at the apex of a pyramidal structure of retainers and dogs' bodies who maintained their master's manse and the exotic flora and fauna of its surrounds. Cleaning, tending, feeding, weeding, cosseting, nursing, and occasionally recapturing those that made it over, under, or through its walls. Baldemar's position was at the pyramid's very base. "He's a wizard?" Baldemar asked early on in his tenure, carrying the ordure of one of the caged beasts to feed the roots of one of the exotic blooms. "So why doesn't he have all this done by imps or afrits or spells?" The recipient of this inquiry was Aldo, a senior under-henchman responsible for the estate's security. He was the old associate of Vunt's through whom the collector had secured this safe berth for the youth. His response was to seize Baldemar's throat in a strong, though not dangerous, grip and say, "There are two answers to that question. First, that the master lacks the thaumaturgical powers to do so. Second, don't ask questions like that if you want to keep your place." Baldemar knew a Vunt-taught way to remove Aldo's hand and bring the older man simultaneously to his knees, but he sensed that the throat seizure was meant kindly, to emphasize the importance of the lesson. So he said, "You're telling me I can ask how to do my work, but not why it must be done?" Aldo released his grip and patted him on the cheek. "Vunt said you were a canny one." The work was reasonably varied and not onerous. The pay enough that he could send half of it to his mother and still have a few coins to put away at the end of each month. Baldemar had his own small room and ate what the other retainers ate, though he sat so far down the refectory table that any conversation at the far end, where the majordomo and the wizard's two apprentices reposed themselves on plush-seated chairs, was inaudible to him. Not that he cared. The few remarks among those senior members of staff he had managed to overhear, discussions of fluxive coherence, asymmetrical resonances, and ley-line convergences, were gibberish. When he reported on his first day, the majordomo had handed him off to Fontance, the third-year apprentice, a sallow, squint-eyed specimen with a too prominent lower lip. Fontance, overseen by a representative of the Wizards Guild, had required Baldemar to perform a number of mental exercises that made no sense at all to the youth. With eyes closed, he was told to listen for tones he could not hear and count objects he could not see or touch. He was told to repeat strings of syllables he could not keep straight in his head. "Not so much as a tinge," the apprentice said as he handed Baldemar over to Aldo. "Couldn't spell his way out of a room with doors in every wall." "Good," said the senior under-henchman as he led the youth to the pens and cages of Thalarion's menagerie. "You won't be tempted to try things that are above you. We had a boy like that a couple of years back. Ended up with his feet where his hands should be." "And vice versa?" Baldemar asked. "No, we never found his hands." 9 months into his new position, Aldo approached Baldemar where he was carefully raking out the scattered bones of small animals he had yesterday introduced into the glass case that housed Thalarion's half-grown Got You Now. This was a carnivorous plant that, in its maturity, would be replanted just inside the estate's surrounding wall at a place where an overhanging tree branch invited trespassers to try their luck. The wizard thought it would be a fine joke for an intruder to drop down and brush against the Got You Now's waiting thorns. The senior under-henchman looked about to make sure they were alone, then spoke softly. "Geberon has been thoroughly robbed," he said, "and Vunt is fled." "Ah," said Baldemar. "You're not likely to be questioned, but best to be prepared." Said the youth. "Would you happen to know if magic leaves traces?" "I would, as it happens," Aldo said. Depends on the strength of the charm and its type.
Something, say, that can open a window and a strong box, themselves protected by charms?
The man cocked his head in thought, pursed his lips a moment, then said, 3 months for sure. 6 at the utmost.
And after, say, 9 months?
Too faint to identify.
Really?
Said Baldemar, fishing out a small rib cage.
Imagine that.
Investigators from the Duke's Provost Department came to the estate and questioned the youth, but he told them truthfully that he'd had no contact with Vunt since the former collector had decried his work habits and thrown him out of Geberon's employ. As part of their investigative routine, the provost men touched a large cabochon to Baldemar's fingertips and saw it glow a bright green. But Aldo, who in his role as Thalerion's security chief had insisted on sitting in on the interrogation, pointed out that their master was a thaumaturge of the Red School, 28th degree. Your detector will show the same result if applied to anyone on the estate, he said, and most of the livestock. The provost left. Aldo saw them safely through the perils that stood between the servants' quarters and the main gate, then came back to Baldemar. You kept your cool? He said.
Vunt thought some training in misdirection would stand me in good stead.
It has. I'm going to recommend to the majordomo that he take you off plant and animal husbandry and make you my assistant. And so Baldemar became a junior under-henchman charged with helping maintain the estate's defences. It was work that suited his abilities and paid more. As well, the uniform was smarter, which he appreciated because he now spent some of his leisure time off the estate in places where young women were known to congregate. He discovered that he cut a passable figure on the dance floor and, by applying himself, became expert in the complex steps and postures that were then fashionable. This won him even closer attention from several young women. On the day he simultaneously celebrated his 17th birthday and said farewell to his virginity, he counted himself more than contented with his lot so far. His 10 halfpennies had been well invested. A month later, there came word that Vunt had been found living under an assumed name in the city of Sisakal. A squad of Vanderoy provost men dispatched to bring him back had done so, though not without sustaining injuries. A chest of gold coins and bullion was also recovered, and, except for a sample of each to be used as evidence, returned to Geberon. The money changer soon after departed for Nendigo. Vunt's trial was a sensation. The Duke himself presided, flanked by his halberdiers. The stands were packed with former delinquent debtors with whom the accused had had dealings, and Vunt's every entrance, exit, and utterance was accompanied by catcalls and rude sounds. The Duke let these demonstrations run on far past the point when he would normally call for decorum, as a way to let the populace discharge tensions that might otherwise be directed at their city's ruler. Aldo had said that since the loot had been recovered, he expected the sentence to be 2 to 4 years in the incarcery. Instead, to the cheers of the attendees who filled the courtroom and spilled out into the plaza beyond, the Duke decreed Vunt would serve 10. Manacled and fettered, the former debt collector was led out to the square where he had once sat beside Geberon's booth, down through Pennant Close, and up to the back door of the prison. Filthy words and objects rained upon him from the close-pressing crowd until his halberdier escorts wearied of receiving the near misses and began to bruise heads with the flats of their axe blades. Baldemar saw none of this. Thalerion forbade his staff to attend the trial. The thaumaturge gave no explanation for his ban, but the junior under-henchman surmised that it was probably one of the wizard's charms obtained through Aldo that Baldemar had used to breach Geberon's security and steal the key to his treasure box. He'll be having a busy time in the tank, Aldo opined, when word of the sentencing reached Thalerion's estate. Plenty in there with him who have scores to settle, and plenty outside who would pay to have someone mark Vunt's slade. He ran a worried hand over his close-cropped pate. Or wipe it clean. Vunt can handle himself, Baldemar said. Certainly against 2 or 3. What, 10 or 12? The matter nagged at the young man as he went about his chores. He recalled how the Incarcery's wall loomed over the Thwack Academy, which was only one door down from its high, smooth expanse of fire-formed stone. On the other side of the wall, judging by the sounds of lockstep and shouted commands, was the Incarcery's exercise yard. Something might be done, he thought, but when he broached the issue with Aldo, phrasing his thought as an innocent question, the older man discouraged him. You might get over the wall, he said. But then what? Drop a rope ladder? Aldo made a face. They're only in the yard for an hour a day, and they're all in it together. The moment your ladder falls, 100 men would rush to climb it. Vunt is strong, but not quick enough to win that race. Besides, the guards are there with their hooks and cincture nooses, and they know how to use them. At night? They're locked in their cells. The corridors outside the cells are barred at intervals, and the staircases are guarded. Said Baldemar, his agile mind grappling with the images Aldo had put into it. Forget it, his superior said. Vunt made his choices. Now he has to take the weight. He fixed the young man with a hard stare. You may feel you owe him, and you may be right, but you don't owe him the ruin of your life. Said Baldemar, nodding. But his mind kept working. Fontance, now in his 5th year of apprenticeship, was not popular with the young women of the neighbourhood. He lacked a good appearance and could not compensate for that natural deficiency with an engaging personality because he was sadly wanting in that department as well. On top of those flaws, the noxious substances with which he routinely worked soaked into his skin so that he trailed a foul odour wherever he went. Arm's length was the closest anyone could stand his presence. Intimacy was out of the question for anyone with a functioning sense of smell. He had one advantage, however, though it was an unfair and, Baldemar thought, an unseemly one. He could throw a spell that would overcome repulsion and dismiss inhibitions. This the young under-henchman discovered during one of the weekly evening dances at the summer pavilion in the Ducal Park. The building stood at the centre of a tract of wooded and meadowed land bestowed upon the people of Vanderoy by the present Duke's grandfather. There were formal gardens, but also secluded bowers and grottos where couples who found each other agreeable on the dance floor could test their compatibility in allied pursuits. On this night, Baldemar had danced several measures with a number of partners. He was always in demand, and stepped out into the covered porch to cool himself. A pale-stoned walkway led down from the porch steps, lit by torches at intervals until it met a copse of trees that offered privacy to those whose activities required it. As the young man stood at the top of the steps, he saw a young woman emerge from under the boughs and walk with a not entirely steady gait toward the hall. As she stumbled through the glow of torchlight, he saw that her clothing was disarranged, and there was a blankness to her gaze that put him in mind of a sleepwalker. When she slowly mounted the steps and passed him without a glance, she trailed an unmistakable odour. A few moments later, Fontance emerged from the bower, adjusting his garments and brushing some evergreen needles from his elbows. Baldemar stepped back into a shadowed part of the porch and observed as the apprentice passed the pavilion and made for the exit that would take him out of the park in the direction of Thalerion's estate. The next day, as he and Aldo went about their duties, he asked his superior, "Does our master set guidelines for the use of magic by his apprentices?" "Of course," was the answer. "The guild requires it." "Such as what?" Aldo rubbed his bristly scalp. "No magic off the premises, no spells cast without a proper entry in the apprentice book, noting type, place and time, intent and effect. The usual." "What would happen to an apprentice who used his powers to seduce one of the kitchen girls here on the estate?" purely for his personal gratification. Aldo blew out a puff of air. Instant dismissal, revocation of all points earned towards a journeymanship, possibly a facial tattooing.
And if the victim was the respectable daughter of a townsman who, say, went to a dance at a summer pavilion and was conjured into the bushes?
Now the older man sucked in his breath and pursed his lips. The guild would take a strong view against. The punishment would be memorable. He shook his head and grimaced at the thought. Though not for the miscreant, unless it's possible for his shade to carry memories into the underworld. Some say that is the case, the better to torment transgressors with useless remorse.
Said Baldemar.
Are we speaking hypothetically? Said Aldo. The young man was silent for a moment, then said,
So far. But I'm thinking of Vunt and his predicament.
Ah, said Aldo. Then we should defer this conversation until we are well off the estate.
Vunt,
Baldemar said. He shook the sleeping man's shoulder, the cloth of the thin prison blanket visibly indenting under his unseeable hand. The prisoner came instantly alert, sat up, peered around, said,
Baldemar,
in a soft voice. Then, seeing himself alone in his cell, sighed and said, But a dream.
No dream,
whispered the young man.
Get up, get dressed. We're going.
Vunt's head turned toward the sound of the voice. Magic, he said. They told me you had no talent for it. He was pulling on his shirt and now reached for his trousers.
They were right, but I have other talents, developed through a very good teacher.
Vunt pulled on his prison shoes, laced them up, and stood. Now what?
Hold out a hand, fingers spread.
When the man did so, Baldemar slipped a ring over one of the fingers.
Now you're unseeable too, except I can see you as a pale shape.
And I you. The door to the cell was unlocked. They exited, and Baldemar closed it behind them. They did the same with the barred gate at the end of the gallery, which swung wide at the young man's touch, as did the solid door with its thick glass insert at the bottom of the steps. Here a guard sat at a desk, his eyes open, though his mind was wrapped in a dream of normality. Moments later, they crossed the prison yard and climbed a rope ladder they pulled up behind them and lowered for their descent down the other side of the wall. Baldemar shook it loose and rolled it up, then looked about him at the once familiar confines of Penandink Close. He led Vunt to the entrance to the plaza, where Geberon's booth once stood.
Here is where we met, he said, where my life changed. And here is where we say goodbye. Take this purse. There is a boat tied up to the wharf where we used to duck recalcitrant debtors in the river.
Magic leaves a signature, Vunt said, tucking the purse inside his shirt. They will trace the one who threw the spells, and through him they will find you.
Wizards know that there are other worlds than this, and a fifth-year apprentice knows how to reach one without leaving a trail. Fontance is already long gone, and the guild will be told enough to discourage them from bringing him home to their own embarrassment.
Baldemar looked up at the clock tower on the far side of the plaza.
Now you must go too. The spells will not last past dawn.
I will wonder why Fontance helped me.
Yes, they will. Aldo and I will put forward some interesting hypothetical explanations.
Vunt laughed and said goodbye. Baldemar watched the pale shadow disappear among the empty booths of the Plaza of the Moneyers. Now, he said to the empty square, the debt is discharged. Chapter 2. The Prognosticant. Baldemar knew something was wrong when he heard the Got You Now muttering to itself. Of course, the predatory tree could not actually speak, neither to itself nor to any other creature. But whenever it had sprung at something and failed to catch it, its barb-thorned twiglets would chafe against each other as they returned to coiled-up readiness. That sound was not audible when the tree succeeded in catching prey. The rubbing of twigs was drowned out by the noises that its victims made while it was feeding. The tree's grumbles were almost inaudible against the background sounds of the estate belonging to Baldemar's employer, the youngish thaumaturge Thalarion. But Baldemar had trained himself to listen for slight changes in the nighttime soundscape. He had recently been elevated to the position of Under-Chief of Security for Thalarion's house and grounds, and he was determined to show himself equal to his responsibilities. Baldemar was not far beyond his 20th birthday, which made him exceptionally young to be an Under-Chief, but his supervisor, Aldo, spoke highly of him. "He's handy, master, so he is," Aldo had told the wizard. "And if we don't give him more scope, he's bound to move on. Why, if he joined the Provost Corps today, he'd have his first chevron before he graduated from the academy." Thalarion had made a face. He did not approve of his servants leaving of their own accord, but he was immersed in a new line of research, so his sphere of interest had lately contracted to his workroom and library in the top 2 floors of the South Tower. He made a gesture to Aldo that expressed both agreement and dismissal, and returned to the tattered old book he was consulting. Apparently, it was resisting his inquiries. To break through to its hidden contents was severely taxing his energies. Aldo had relayed this conversation to Baldemar, both to reinforce the younger man's morale, which inevitably tended to diminish under the daily tedium of henchmaning, and to prepare him for a sudden change. "I've seen himself like this before," Aldo said. "He wraps himself up in old books for weeks, even months. Then suddenly he bursts out with some project that will have us hopping, and no mistake." Baldemar looked forward to the hopping as a potential relief from the mundanities of guarding the wizard's estate. But the boredom of routine never led him to slack his duties. In his first career, when Baldemar had been a teenaged collector of debts for a moneylender, he had learned how small details could greatly affect outcomes. Thus, as he came across the got you now in an agitated humour, he was alert. He had found it in such a state twice before, in each case because a sleekit had run for cover under its lower branches, pursued by a night bird. A sleekit was too small to engage the tree's appetite, but an owl or a night merle would trigger an instant response. If the bird was flying fast enough, it might lose no more than a few feathers, a small price to pay for a lesson in life or death. But as Baldemar now examined the tree, he saw no plumes or pinions on the ground. Instead, he spotted a few fibres of cloth caught on one of the thorny tendrils, now slowly curling, rewinding for the next opportunity. Baldemar stepped back and shone his hand lumen on the ground around the tree's roots, then along the flagstoned path that led from the manse's rear door to a gate in the wall surrounding the estate. He saw nothing, but then he stooped to look closer and realized that the nothing actually signified something. There were no footprints on the stones or the grass, but there was a peculiarity that a young man who was handy at security might notice. The flagstones were spaced apart, about the distance of a normal walking pace. The grass between the stones had not been clipped for a week or more, so its blades were a little higher than the granite. And those blades all inclined in the direction of the manse's back door. Baldemar wet a finger and held it up. Found no wind. He touched one of the leaning blades of grass with that finger's tip and saw the little green spikes spring upright. He touched another and one more, and each time he saw the same response. "A skimmer," he said to himself, and looked toward the rear of the manse, not at the door, but at the floors above, and especially at the windows. Of course, again, he saw nothing. The intruder would not have come gliding over the wall, passing just above the reach of the got you now, without some kind of device to render himself difficult to see. Not an invisibility spell, Baldemar thought. A cantrip of that power would have set off alarms in Thalarion's own chamber, and several of his non-human servants would have been on the scene while Baldemar and Aldo were still turning toward the noise. So, it will be some kind of light bender, he thought, as he carefully scanned the stonework ornamenting the rear of the manse. That would fit with the use of a skimmer. He had already deduced that he was dealing with an operative of the Thieves' Guild. Now, as he raised his gaze higher up the manse's walls, he saw it. A faint shimmer that, once he locked onto it, resolved itself into the outline of a man standing in mid-air near a third-floor window. Baldemar had already drawn his sidearm, a bolt gun modified by the wizard to throw balls of a substance that stuck fast to any organic material it encountered, which would then ignite and burn with a fierce heat. Once lit, it could not be extinguished until it had consumed at least 20 times its weight in matter. He clipped the lumen to the weapon and widened its beam, then aimed it at the intruder. "It's a flamer," he said. "Once I press the stud, nothing will save you. Better come down." There was a moment when events could have gone either way. Then the faintly visible figure settled slowly toward the path. As it neared the ground, Baldemar beckoned with the finger of his free hand, saying, "This way a little. There's a thing that lives under the doorstep. I don't know what it's called, but it has a lot of legs, even more teeth, and it's always hungry." The man shape now stood on the path, and Baldemar could see the disc on which the intruder had flown over the wall. He stepped back, the flamer still aimed, and said, "Remove the light suit, then step off the skimmer. Slowly and carefully." The suit slit down the front. Out of it stepped a young man of Baldemar's own age, whose face was dominated by a too prominent nose and an attempt to wear an expression of stoic disregard. The attempt failed, and the captive sighed. Baldemar inspected him, saw no visible weaponry, though there would probably be a knife in a boot or a leather sock loaded with lead balls up one sleeve. "Where did you get the suit?" he said. "The Guild's storehouse," was the reply. "The Thieves' Guild?" The thief's neck stiffened. "The Ancient and Honourable Society of Purloiners and Purveyors." Baldemar shrugged. "As you say. And the skimmer?" The thief looked down at the black disc. "The same." Baldemar was interested. The skin-tight suit that bent light around itself was a relic of a bygone eon when, according to legend, magic had been unreliable and people had to invent machines that could do what spells and cantrips could not. The skimmer, too, was an artifact out of antiquity, but the Thieves' Guild went back beyond memory. Who knew what it kept in its subterranean storerooms? "I thought they could fly no higher than a man's knee," Baldemar said. "I tinkered with it," the thief said. "More height, though less time aloft. Now, can we get on with it?" Getting on with it meant contacting the Provost Corps and turning over his prisoner. Baldemar would receive an informal commendation, and the thief would enter the process by which the Guild and the Corps settled such matters. There would be a negotiation in which the Corps would demand unconscionable riches, and the Guild would offer a miserable pittance. Gradually, over days or even weeks, the two polarities would approach each other, and the penalty would be agreed upon, then paid. Meanwhile, the thief would walk a treadmill in the Duke's contemplarium, turning gears that ground grain for the ducal bakery. "Why so glum?" Baldemar asked, when he had assured himself that the man's weapons were piled with the light suit on the skimmer. "Occasions like this must be part of your métier." The thief sighed again. "I'm only a fifth-year apprentice," he said, "with a number of defaults against me. This was to have been a simple reconnaissance, to note any recent changes to the estate's architecture. A good result would have seen me through to my 6th year." He rubbed a hand across his face, top to bottom. "Now, I may be facing expulsion from the Guild." If the tale was meant to evoke sympathy in Baldemar, it did not. Collecting debts, sometimes with violence, always with the implication thereof, had already given him a wealth of experience in life's painful ironies, He had grown a hard shell against which the troubles of strangers struck with all the éclat of a thistledown settling on a silken scarf. But his earlier profession had also made him adept at spotting advantage and opportunity. "What is your name?" he said.
"Raphaelon,"
said the apprentice. Baldemar thought for a moment, his agile mind chasing possibilities along the paths of possible futures, seeing where the avenues divided or dead-ended in a cul-de-sac. "Suppose," he said, "I don't turn you over to the provosts." Raphaelon's brows drew down. He half-turned and looked over his shoulder at the doorstep where the multi-legged appetite lurked, then came back to Baldemar, tensed and ready for desperate measures. "No," said the wizard's henchman. "I'm not gratuitously cruel. I wish to propose a mutually beneficial arrangement." The thief only half relaxed. "What, then?" Baldemar said, "Part of my job is to protect this place against thieves. You are a thief, or at least on your way to being one, if I don't turn you in. You have a rare gift for stating the obvious. And you have a lot of nerve for a man facing expulsion from his guild, not to mention a long session of wheel-walking." The thief's face fell again. "What is it you want?" he said. "To know the things thieves know that people like me don't." Raphaelon's eyes went wide, and he drew in an audible breath. "Divulge guild secrets?" "Hush," Baldemar said. "If you wake my superior, there can be but one outcome." The thief lowered his voice, but his outrage remained as deep as before. "I am sworn to keep the secrets of the craft. The guild's honour is my own. I could never—" "The guild will still have its honour after it has turned you out into the streets, where, if you are caught thieving, there will be no guild to bargain for you. What happens then?" Baldemar had heard tales. Guildless malefactors caught stealing were reduced to permanent servitude, cleaning out cesspits or treading cloth in the pools of stale urine used in dyeing wool and linen. By the expression on his face, Raphaelon had heard the same accounts. Baldemar waited while the thief chased his own possibilities through an unappealing series of future corners. Finally, he turned a grim face toward his captor. "You would tell no one?" "If I told," Baldemar said, "the telling would have to include the fact that I'd acquired forbidden knowledge. Your guild would surely want to make examples of both of us." That was one of the future avenues Baldemar had peeked into, the one where the Thieves' Guild hired the terrible and tenacious guild of Vindicators to exact revenge against a wizard's errant henchman. Neither Aldo nor Thalarion could protect him against professional assassins who never gave up, even if the thaumaturge could be bothered to try. "What kind of things would you want to know?" Baldemar suppressed the smile his lips wanted to form. They were past the point of decision and into the details. "Not the tricks of the trade," he said. "More the frame of reference." Raphaelon did not look happy, but when Baldemar told him to pick up his possessions and follow him to the staff refectory, the thief did as he was bid. "I'll make us a pot of punch," the henchman said. "Careful, step wide of that flower bed. It's not what it seems." They sat in the little office Baldemar had arranged for himself beneath the stairs that came down to the servants' level. "What I want to know," he said, pouring 2 mugs of punch, "is how thieves think. What they see when they look at a property like this that I might not see." Raphaelon drank some of the hot brew, then looked at Baldemar over the rim of the cup. The way his eyes narrowed said he was reassessing his captor. "Most people want to know about locks and doors and windows, how they can make them completely secure." "But they can't, can they?" Baldemar said. "They can only make them more difficult." "Time-consuming is the term we use. Any lock, every lock, can be defeated. The issue becomes how much time it takes and whether the reward is worth the risk of taking that long."
Thieves do not like to be noticed. Back to my question, Baldemar said. Raphaelon sipped his punch and considered, then said, It's mostly a matter of learning to see what isn't there. Baldemar put down his cup. Obfuscation will not serve you. I am not being needlessly obscure, the thief said. Consider your master's garden. He paused to order his thoughts, then continued. When you look at it, you see the lawns, the walks, the trees and plants, the walls, and so on, including all the traps and man-takers. And you don't? Oh, I see all that is there, but I see what isn't there. I see gaps and discontinuities, places where sight lines do not converge, or where there are lacks occasioned by too much confidence in that which can be seen. Baldemar thought where he had found the thief. The upper floor windows, he said. The type and quality of their locks are known. Their utility is scant. You trusted in the ground floor wards and the garden traps to thwart any attempts. And they did. Raphaelon drank some more, then his nod conceded the point. It's true that Gotyenau's reach was slightly greater than I anticipated, but this was a reconnaissance, intended to discover just such a detail. So you'll be back, Baldemar said. Not I. Despoiling wizards is no work for apprentices. The information will go into the guild's memory. Someday, it might be useful. Baldemar made a mental note to strengthen the locks on the upper floor windows. Time gained was an advantage. They conversed through a second round of punch, and he learned more. The value of shadows, the use of indirection and distraction, the tendency of guards to look around but not to look up, the ill wisdom of relying on watch beasts. Except herbs, Raphaelon advised. They are relentlessly single-minded, and almost as much danger to those they guard as to those they supposedly protect against. The thief finished his punch and stood up. Life is often a matter of giving up this to win that, he said, and I believe I've given up enough information to win my freedom. One more thing, said Baldemar. You spoke of your guild's memory. What exactly is that? Raphaelon showed reluctance again, but Baldemar knew that once a dam had broken, a trickle would easily follow the flood. After a moment, the thief shrugged and said, The guild maintains copies of the plans of every major structure in the city, and most of the minor ones as well. They are continually updated, based on reconnaissances like mine. Ah, said Baldemar, disguising a pang of self-chagrin. He had never thought to study the plans of Thalerion's manse and grounds. He would rectify that lack. Now he merely nodded and said, That makes sense. And will the guild's memory now include the fact that Thalerion's current Under-Chief of Security is today wiser than he was yesterday in the ways of thiefdom? He smiled to take the needle out of the question. No, said Raphaelon. Baldemar escorted him to a side gate, along with his skimmer and weapons, and unlocked the portal. The thief left without saying goodbye, but turned before the henchman closed the door. You're a decent sort, so one more thing. Out of kindness, he said. Your master lately approached the guild about engaging us to acquire some items for him, under the usual terms. He was turned down. Wizards, Baldemar knew, could acquire for themselves almost anything they wanted, either by mundanely spending wealth or by resorting to their arcane arts. The exceptions were the possessions of other spell-slingers. Your guildmasters, Baldemar proposed, did not wish to draw the ire of the venerable and worthy council of wizards and thaumaturges. They did not. Baldemar shrugged. Well then. The thing is, Raphaelon said, your master did not trudge away, shoulders slumped, a man who knows he cannot have what he craves. No. He left like a man who believes he can espy other paths to his heart's desire. said Baldemar. Indeed, said the thief. So, best be prepared for adventures. The Baldemar who closed the door was a more thoughtful henchman than the young man who had opened it. My office is a little small, Baldemar said to Aldo. His supervisor did not look up from the papers he was frowning over, but said, It fit me well enough when I was under chief. Baldemar said nothing and remained standing before Aldo's desk. After a moment, the older man looked up and said, What? A place where they store summer furniture would suit me better. Aldo's gaze went from Baldemar to the papers, then back again. Will the tables and chairs fit under the stairs? He said. Yes, I've measured. Then do it. He returned his attention to the documents, saying, Are you any good at double entry? But when he looked up, the young man was already gone. Baldemar had taken to heart Raphaelon's revelation about thieves studying the estate's blueprints. He had poked about in a dusty storeroom and found a chest that contained the plans. His review of the documents, much amended over the centuries, was more enlightening than he had expected. It turned out that the centuries-old manse had once been owned by a minor aristocrat who, for purposes now long forgotten, had installed speaking tubes from various rooms down into the quarters of his majordomo, valet, and cook. During some later restoration, the summoning whistles had been removed and the tubes smoothly plastered over. Baldemar traced the sound conduits and found one that led from Thalerion's workroom down to a little windowless room that had once been the long-dead valet's quarters, the room that had now long been used for storing summer garden furniture. By placing an ear trumpet against a particular spot on the back wall, the young man could listen in on what his master was doing in his tower, high above the workaday spaces of his manse. Baldemar arranged his new quarters so that the wall with the patched-over speaking tube was easily accessible. He covered the crucial spot with a colourful silk wall hanging of an old-time man-at-arms he had bought at a street bazaar. The ear trumpet served as a paperweight on Baldemar's small desk, though why a windowless cubicle needed such an object went unquestioned. Baldemar was grateful that he had discussed with Raphaelon the merits of hiding objects in plain sight. When Aldo came by to inspect his underchief's new surroundings, he absently picked up the instrument, blew into it, shrugged, and put it back where he found it. Unlike the space under the stairs, Baldemar's new location had a door. At first he left it open, but gradually he took to shutting it when his supervisor gave him desk work, an occupation whose frequency was gradually increasing as Aldo found the young man to be a better ledger-keeper and not averse to being assigned the task. Baldemar kept an account book open on his desk whenever he was in the office with the door closed. Then, if the doorknob squeaked, he had deliberately roughened its mechanism so that it protested when turned. He could be found bending over a column of figures or an itemized list of materiel, stylus in hand, brows down-drawn in concentration. The moment before the squeak would have found Baldemar leaning back, the narrow end of the trumpet to his ear and its bell mouth pressed gently against the silk covering the tube that snaked up to Thalerion's workroom. In that position, as the weeks and months piled up, he heard much that confused him, and some that caused him growing concern. Every profession encouraged among its members equal measures of rivalry and collegiality. When advocates and intercessors went into court to do verbal battle, they might take no prisoners, but once the verdict was decided, they could go to a tavern and drink together like veterans of the same regiment. Butchers and shoemakers might decry the quality of their competitors' wares the better to shine a rosy light on their own, but when the Duke sought to raise more taxes from their trades, they would unite in solidarity and throw unappetizing objects at the walls of the ducal estate. Wizards, however, were a much different box of biscuits.
They had a guild, a powerful one, but its energies were largely directed at discovering any use of magic by non-members and putting a stop to it, usually by means intended to discourage, indeed horrify, any tyro who might try their hand at unlicensed thaumaturgy. But when it came to regulating wizard-to-wizard rivalries, the venerable and worthy council of wizards and thaumaturges preferred to remain neutral. Unless a feud got out of hand and threatened to cause mass casualties or significant structural damage. Thus, wizards were largely free to despoil and defame each other, even to inflict injury or exile upon a rival, so long as they did not attract the attention of the civil power. If the Duke called upon the Wizards' Guild to restrain one of their colleagues, the guildmasters were bound by mighty oaths to coordinate their powers and rein in the errant spellslinger. In Vanderoy, no such intervention had been necessary since the dreadful quarrel between Audemar the Baleful and Sasenchar of the Unseen Hand, back when the present Duke's grandfather occupied the high seat. Audemar's demons, summoned from the seventh plane, and the myrmidons Sasenchar concocted from vermin in his garden, had wreaked devastation upon half the city. The pair's punishment, still continuing in the vertical maze the masters had erected in the Plaza of Admonitions, was required viewing for all members of the Wizards' Guild on every anniversary of the disaster. As a child, Baldemar had been taken by his mother to see the two thaumaturges, shrunken to the size of clothes pegs, climbing up and running along and sliding down the glassed-in ledges, ramps, and ladders, pursued by stinging spiders. Occasionally, the spiders succeeded in capturing one of the felons, wrapping him in a silk cocoon in preparation for feeding. At that point, a miniature gargoyle awoke from its slumber in the center of the maze and came to release the captive while the spider fruitlessly stung its stone flesh. Then the chase would begin again. "Let their fate be a lesson to you," Baldemar's mother had said. "Have no truck with wizards." And yet here he was, a henchman to a young thaumaturge whose reputation for eccentricity had begun to soar above the average. Baldemar sometimes pondered on the sequence of events that had brought him here, and speculated on where the universe's relentless unfolding would carry him next. He hoped the next few turns of the wheel would not embroil him in some contest between Thalarion and another thaumaturge. But from as much as he could understand of what he was hearing through the ear trumpet, it appeared that his hopes were not to be blessed by fate. Thalarion had conceived an ambition, and a wizard's ambition was seldom unaccompanied by the descriptor overweening.